Welcome to our second presentation in educational series. This month's topic is on miticide resistance. Hi, I'm Sarah Hickman, Engagement Officer for VMIRI, Varroa Mite Innovation and Resilience Initiative, and we have Tonya Johnson, our Bee Biosecurity Officer, with us as well. Firstly, I'll run through a brief update on where we are with resistance, followed on by what resistance is and how it occurs, and then we will talk a little bit about non-synthetic treatments. And then Tonya will guide us through the next steps, including IPM and a few scenarios to help you determine if you have mite resistance, and then how to manage that. Synthetic pyrethroid resistance in varroa mites was first confirmed in New South Wales on the 5th of February 2026, marking the first detection of this type of resistance in Australia. Since then, 2 genetic mutations have been identified across both New South Wales and Queensland. These mutations, known as L925I and L925M, are linked to resistance and have also been detected overseas in North America and Europe. This resistance affects commonly used pyrethroids, miticides such as Baverol and Apistan, and in Queensland it's now been confirmed across multiple local government areas in the south. Biosecurity Queensland has now confirmed the first detection of varroa mite resistance to emitraz in southeast Queensland. Emitraz is a formamidine chemical, and it is also Apivar and Apitraz that has the emitraz chemical component. This follows similar confirmations in New South Wales, so we are now seeing this resistance emerge in multiple areas. Genetic testing by the Elizabeth MacArthur Agricultural Institute, completed on the 30th of March 2026, identified a specific mutation known as Y215H after what appeared to be a secondary treatment failure. This mutation is associated with reduced effectiveness of synthetic formamidine products, including your commonly used treatments like Apivar and Apitraz. At this stage, Biosecurity Queensland and New South Wales DPI are continuing surveillance and testing to better understand how widespread this resistance is. The key focus of this work is to determine where this resistance has come from and how far it's spread, so we can better support beekeepers in managing it moving forward. Let's dive into what resistance is and how it occurs, and followed on by non-synthetic treatment, and then our next steps as we navigate our way through this issue. So firstly, what is miticide resistance? It's a genetic survival trait and occurs when some mites survive treatment, they then reproduce, and then they pass that survival trait on, which in turn reduces the effectiveness of that product over time. So how does this occur? Well, there's numerous ways that it can occur, and some examples include using the same chemical back to back and not rotating the mode of action. Now, the mode of action is the way a chemical works to kill the mite. So when that is being used back to back or more times than is allowed per year, that can cause resistance issues. Also, mites that are being exposed to sublethal doses can also contribute. So this may include things like using old brood comb where residual chemical is stored in the wax, or not completing the proper treatment period, so leaving it in for longer or not leaving it in for long enough to get that full dose in. Other actions can also increase the resistance, which includes mixing your own miticides or even using expired products, along with underdosing and not using the required amount of product. In the long term, this does not save you money. So let's break it down what resistance is and how it happens. So imagine a population of varroa mites in a hive. Each mite has its own genetic makeup, basically its DNA, and that's what determines how it responds to things like chemical treatments. Now, in most cases, mites are susceptible to treatments. In this case, the black squiggles. But every now and again, you can get a mite with a random mutation, something a little bit different in its genetics, which is represented by the blue squiggle. That mutation might do a few things. Mites can survive treatment if a mutation in their genes results in a change to a protein, enzyme, or structure that allows it to survive. So, a mutation for a protein could result in it being folded a little differently so that the chemical doesn't interact with the target site. It could also make the mite's outer shell slightly thicker so that the chemical can't actually penetrate all the way through. Or it might be an enzyme that allows the mite to actually break down or detoxify the chemicals more effectively. Either way, that one mite is a bit tougher to kill. So here we have a mite with a mutation in blue. That allows her to survive the treatment. Now, this mutation is then passed on to her offspring so that they can also survive that treatment. So what happens when we treat? So the beekeeper does the right thing. They monitor, they see mites above threshold, and then they decide it's time for a treatment. Let's say they use a synthetic pyrethroid like Apistan or Baverol. Most of the mites in the hive will die, but that one mite with the mutation, that survives. And here is where it becomes a problem. That surviving mite goes on to reproduce and passes that resistant trait onto its offspring. So now, instead of just one resistant mite, you've got a whole growing population of mites that are harder to kill with that same chemical and mode of action. And over time, with repeated use of the same product, that resistant population builds and builds until the chemical becomes far less effective. Let's look at the same scenario again, but with a better outcome. So again, we've got our mite population in the hive. Most of the mites are susceptible to the chemical. These are the mites with the black squiggles. Those are the ones without resistance. And then we've got that one mite with the mutation, the resistant one. When it's time to treat, the beekeeper treats with a synthetic pyrethroid or formamidine like Apistan or Apivar. Just like before, most of the mites die, but that resistant mite survives, reproduces, and passes that trait on to the next generation. But here's where the things can change. So now the beekeeper monitors again, sees that the mites are above threshold, and instead of using that same chemical, they rotate. So this time, they might use a different product, something like apibioxol, an oxalic acid treatment. So that has a different mode of action. Now, apibioxol works in a completely different way to both of the synthetic pyrethroid and formamidine. It has a different mode of action to both of the classes that have confirmed resistance. So even though those mites had resistance to the first treatment, they're not resistant to this one. And this time, the treatment is able to knock down those mites much more effectively. So by rotating your treatments, you're reducing the chance of resistant mites building up in your hive. Rotation isn't just a recommendation, it's critical. It helps maintain treatment effectiveness, gives you a much better chance of controlling mite populations over time, and this is a key part of integrated pest management. Not relying on one tool, but using a combination of strategies to stay ahead of the mites. I'm now going to give a little talk on the other types of chemicals that we can be using, such as organic treatments. So oxalic acid is another key non-synthetic option with two main products. We have apibioxol and aluin cap. Apibioxol is a fast-acting or flash treatment that targets the phoretic mites, so it works best when the colonies are broodless or during a brood break, whether natural or forced. It can be used with supers on, and it leaves minimal residue when used correctly, but it does have requirements such as strict PPE, personal protective equipment, especially a respirator during the vaporization and goggles. Aluin cap, on the other hand, it's a slow release strip that works over time, allowing contact with the mites as they emerge from the brood. This makes it more forgiving than the flash treatments. It can also be used with supers on and has low residue risk. It's easier to handle and is suitable for organic systems or organic farming. The other two non-synthetic treatments are Formic Pro and ApiGuard. So Formic Pro is a really powerful option because it's one of the only treatments that can penetrate the capped brood, meaning it hits mites both under the cappings and on the adult bees. It can also be used with supers on, which makes it very practical during a honey flow. However, it is quite harsh and temperature dependent, and if not used correctly, it can cause brood loss, queen issues, and bee mortality. We have ApiGuard, on the other hand. It's a gentler organic extract. It works on the phoretic mites only, so it needs to be in for a longer period to work across that brood cycle. It works best in moderate temperatures, so between 15 and 40 degrees, whereas your Formic Pro is strictly between that 10 and 29.5 degree ambient daytime temperatures. ApiGuard, you do need to take your supers off because it does taint the flavour of the honey, and we don't want that. So look, the bottom line, there's no one silver bullet. It's about choosing the right tool for the situation and rotating to stay ahead of resistance. On that note, I'm going to hand to Tonya Johnson, our Bee Biosecurity Officer. Thanks, Tonya.
Thanks, Sarah. G'day, everyone. I'm Tonya Johnson. I am your Bee Biosecurity Officer here in Queensland, and I will be guiding you through what to do if you have resistant mites and some management options there. So the first thing to ask yourself is, are synthetic treatments working in my hives? The only way to determine this is by monitoring your varroa levels, so you can't manage what you don't measure. Monitor your mite loads before, during, and after treatments, and if mite numbers remain high during and after treatment, then this may indicate potential resistance. If this is your case, please report your findings to DPI via B123, the Varroa email, or the DPI call centre. And as always, rotate the chemical modes of actions. This will help kill the resistant mites and slow resistant development. It's important to note that in the build-up phase, reinfestation could look like resistance. So be sure to monitor your mite drop once treatment is in, via sticky mats or core flute. And if you're getting a significant mite drop each day, the treatment could be working and it could be reinfestation. So to help simplify things a little bit, I've created an example of what an extreme resistance scenario can look like. Unfortunately, this case is similar to what we have, what has been reported to our Vermeer team here. So scenario one, I go to my apiary and I monitor my varroa levels. I find an average of 20 mites per alcohol wash around my apiary. I'm past threshold, so I apply Baverol strips as per the label. 6 to 8 weeks, I go back, remove treatment, and perform my post-treatment washes, only to find my mite numbers have risen to 120 plus. I notice my bees and my brood looking very unhealthy. My numbers should be at 0, but instead I have colony collapse. If this sounds like you, immediately call DPI and report your findings. One of our team will be in touch and guide you on the next steps. So scenario 2, a better management choice. I go to my apiary to monitor my varroa levels. I find an average of 20 mites per alcohol wash around my apiary. I'm past threshold. I apply Baverol strips as per the label. 3 to 4 weeks later, I go back. I go back to the apiary to perform my mid-treatment wash. On average, I find 45 mites in my alcohol washes. I'm concerned. Numbers should be dropping towards zero. Instead, they've doubled. So I insert a sticky mat to monitor mite drop over 3 to 5 days. So there's two different outcomes to talk about here. The first outcome, I take the mat out and I have a significant number of dead mites on the sticky mat, which suggests the treatment is working and reinfestation is a potential factor here. So I continue to leave the strips in for the full duration of the treatment. Then I perform a post-treatment wash to determine varroa levels. The second outcome, I have very little to no dead mites on the mat, which suggests possible resistance. I call DPI immediately to report my findings and seek confirmation. I consider options like rotating to a chemical with a different mode of action or implementing a brood break combined with a fast knockdown treatment. The difference between this scenario and the one on the previous slide is that here I'm being much more proactive, not reactive. So, although resistance can gradually reduce the efficacy of synthetic treatments, they still play a very important role in Varroa integrated pest management. However, when treatments fail, as in the scenarios I've provided, it's necessary to escalate your management options. In extreme cases, this may mean taking the hive out of production and keeping the colony alive. So let's look at the first scenario where the beekeeper washed 120 mites post-treatment and is now seeing the early stages of colony collapse. The first step in this situation is to consider it out of production. So do not harvest honey, queen cells, or any products from that hive. The beekeeper then has several options to manage this situation. One approach is to alternate synthetic treatments with a different mode of action. Using a different mode of action will target and kill the resistant mites. So, for example, switching from Baverol to oxalic acid. Another approach is to remove all capped brood or all brood from the hive. Remember, around 70% to 80% of Varroa reside and reproduce under capped brood. And if this hive is showing parasitic mite syndrome, this indicates a high mite load. Bees developing under these cappings are likely weak or malformed in scenarios like this. So by removing all capped brood or all brood, it prevents these mites from emerging. Combining removal of brood with installation of a different mode of action will target those remaining phoretic mites in the hive. Another option is creating a brood break via isolation or queen isolation or queen removal. No queen means no brood, and no brood means that gradually the mites will hatch and have nowhere to hide, so they're exposed. You can then hit the mites with an alternative fast knockdown treatment and remove them from the hive. Finally, you can use the Varroa controller to allow the brood to hatch while doing a fast knockdown treatment of the phoretic mites in the hive. With this method, keep in mind that in heavy infestations, damage to the developing brood is already extensive, so many emerging adult bees will likely be weak or malformed. These approaches are not just restricted to heavily infested colonies and can be applied more broadly. Hive recovery is not guaranteed and may already be too late in some extreme cases. This highlights why taking a proactive approach is far more effective than a reactive one. If the chemical is no longer effective enough to justify its use, please stop applying it. Focus on reducing those resistant mite numbers, and once the numbers are lowered, the chemical may be viable again in the future. Also, be aware of your situation. If a colony is already collapsing from high varroa loads, use caution with chemical treatments, as some may place additional stress on the bees and do more harm than good. And lastly, for me, please remember to implement a barrier system. A barrier system helps limit the spread of honeybee pests and diseases such as varroa-resistant mites between hives and apiaries. So, by controlling the movement of bees, equipment, and people within the apiary or apiaries, a barrier system makes it easier to contain and manage issues early before they spread. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks for that, Tonya. There was a lot of really good information that you've shared. So, to summarise, if using miticides, there are important practices to follow to prevent or slow resistance. The most important step is to apply integrated pest management. Use cultural controls wherever possible. Example, implementing a barrier system. Mechanical controls, example, queen isolation or drone trapping when possible. And if chemicals are necessary, combining a brood break, natural or induced, with chemical treatment to improve effectiveness. Avoid under-treating or half-dosing or over-treating, double dosing. Follow the correct timing. Don't remove treatments too early or leave them in too long. Rotate chemicals with different modes of action. Don't use the same type back to back. This helps target resistant mites. Follow the permit or Australian label. Many chemicals don't yet have Australian labels, so the permits override the overseas instructions and conditions may differ. Well, that concludes our session. We hope this has been educational and you feel more confident in managing your colonies. If you do find resistance in your apiaries, please remember that synthetic pyrethroids and formamidines remain a valuable tool for most beekeepers. When used correctly and rotated with other treatments, they can still play an effective role in varroa management. If you would like to get in touch, please see our contact details. Thank you very much and take care.
Thanks all.